The stranger at the bus station. It was the night before Valentine's Day. I remember it clearly because the city, usually bustling with people making last-minute romantic purchases, was unusually quiet. I was 17, maybe 18, just finishing a late shift at work. My feet ached, and all I wanted was to get home, wrap myself in a warm blanket, and plan the next day's festivities. The streets were eerily empty as I walked to the bus station. The air was heavy, thick with the promise of rain. The wind howled, carrying with it a cold that bit into my skin despite my thick jacket. Clouds loomed overhead, churning like dark, restless spirits. A flock of birds flew low, cutting sharply through the air before vanishing beyond the rooftops. Something about their frantic movement unsettled me, but I brushed it off as fatigue. I reached the station and sat on the cold metal bench. I was alone. The streetlights flickered, their dim glow struggling against the encroaching darkness. I plugged in my earphones, letting the music drown out the whispering wind. Yet, even as the melodies played, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, but no one was there. Just empty streets and shadows, stretching long and thin. Minutes passed. I checked the time, 8:23 p.m. The bus was late. It wasn't unusual, but the stillness around me felt wrong, oppressive even. I shifted uncomfortably, my eyes drawn to the corner where the shadows were the darkest. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something shifting just out of sight. I blinked, and it was gone. Then, the rain began. Soft at first, a gentle patter that quickly grew into a heavy downpour. The sound was deafening, a relentless drumming against the metal roof. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter, watching as the rainwater pooled along the curb, swirling in murky circles. The world outside the station became a blurred mess of grey and black, isolating me from the rest of the city. That's when I noticed him. A man stood at the edge of the platform, his figure distorted by the rain. He was tall, unnaturally so, his shoulders hunched beneath a long black coat that brushed against his ankles. A hat was pulled low over his face, hiding his features in shadow. He was perfectly still, facing me, his posture rigid, unnatural. I didn't see him arrive. There were no footsteps, no sound to announce his presence. One moment I was alone, and the next he was just there. My heart skipped a beat, a cold chill creeping down my spine. I looked away, pretending not to notice, hoping he'd leave. But when I dared to glance back, he was closer. He stood just outside the station now, the rain cascading over his shoulders, soaking his coat. But he didn't seem to care. His head was tilted, angled in a way that suggested he was watching me. Even though his face was hidden, I could feel eyes on me, cold and unwavering. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and turned up the volume on my music, desperate to drown out the fear tightening in my chest. But it did little to help. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and a sickly sweet scent drifted towards me like decaying flowers. The man moved. It was subtle. A small shift of his shoulders, a step closer to the overhang. The shadows clung to him, distorting his shape, making him seem longer, taller. His movements were too fluid, too smooth, as if he were gliding rather than walking. I stood up, my legs shaky. The bus had to be coming soon. It had to. I checked the time again. 8:47 p.m. I had been waiting for over 20 minutes and no one else had arrived. No pedestrians, no cars, nothing. It was as if the world had forgotten this place existed. I looked up, and he was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A noise echoed behind me, a wet, slithering sound like something heavy dragging across the ground. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. He was there, standing just a few feet away, his head cocked to the side. The shadows twisted around his body, clinging to his limbs like smoke. His face was still hidden, but I could feel his eyes boring into me, piercing through the darkness. My chest tightened, a primal fear flooding my senses. The man took a step forward, his body bending at odd angles, his arms too long, his fingers curling unnaturally. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the cold metal bench, my heart hammering so loud I could hear it over the rain. He moved again, his limbs jerking, cracking as if his bones were breaking and resetting with each step. "You shouldn't have waited." His voice was a whisper, carried on the wind, yet it echoed all around me, chilling me to the bone. It was distorted, layered, as if more than one voice was speaking at once. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen, paralyzed by his gaze. His face began to shift beneath the hat, the shadows peeling away to reveal hollow eyes, black as the void, and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide, filled with teeth that were sharp, jagged, inhuman. The headlights of the bus cut through the storm, its engine a roar of salvation. The spell broke, and I stumbled forward, nearly falling as I dashed to the curb. The doors opened with a hiss, and I threw myself inside, gasping for air. I turned back. The man was gone, the platform empty. But the rain, it was wrong. It fell too slowly, the droplets hanging in the air, distorted like time itself was warped. My eyes burned, the world spinning. I collapsed into a seat, my body trembling, my heart racing. The bus pulled away, its engine growling as it cut through the rain. I exhaled, relief washing over me. It was over. But then, in the window's reflection, I saw him. Sitting right behind me, his face twisted into that unnatural grin, eyes hollow, mouth stretched wide. His head twitched, his neck snapping to the side with a sickening crack as his voice echoed once more. "You shouldn't have waited," I screamed, a raw, desperate sound, but the driver didn't react. The passengers were still, their faces blank, eyes glazed over, unseeing. I was alone. The man leaned closer, his cold breath brushing against my neck, carrying that sickly sweet scent of rot. His fingers, long and skeletal, wrapped around the seat, inching towards me. The lights flickered, the bus rumbled, shuddering as if resisting something dark and ancient. And then everything went black. To this day, no one believes me. They say the bus never came that night, that the storm knocked out power in that part of the city. They found my bag at the station, soaked through, abandoned on the bench, but they never found me, because I never got off that bus. And every night, as the rain falls and the shadows gather, I'm still there, trapped, with him watching me, waiting. Just like I did. The ride that never ended. Valentine's Day dawned with a soft golden hue, the sun painting the sky in shades of pink and amber. The city was just beginning to stir, its streets still draped in a sleepy haze. I was excited, eager to visit my sister and share in the day's festivities. My heart was light, my mind racing with thoughts of laughter and love. I stood by the roadside, watching as the world slowly woke around me. I tried to book an Uber, but none were available. I waved at a few taxis, but they sped by without slowing down. Time was ticking, and impatience gnawed at me. I decided to take a boda, a motorcycle taxi. It was fast, convenient, and I'd taken them countless times before. I didn't have to wait long. A man pulled up on his bike, the engine humming softly. His face was hidden behind a helmet with a dark, reflective visor, masking his features entirely. He wore a long black coat that seemed out of place on such a warm morning, the fabric fluttering slightly in the breeze. He didn't say a word, just tilted his head in acknowledgement. Something about his silence made me uneasy, a cold prickle running down my spine. But I shook off the feeling, blaming it on my impatience. I climbed onto the back of the motorcycle, gripping the edges of the seat tightly. "Take me to location," I said, giving him the address. He didn't respond. No nod, no sound, nothing. He just revved the engine, and we shot forward faster than I expected. The city blurred around us as we weaved through traffic with unnatural agility. I tightened my grip, my heart thudding as the buildings whipped by in flashes of colour and light. The wind howled in my ears, cold and biting, far colder than it should have been on a sunny morning. I could feel it seeping through my jacket, numbing my skin. We sped past familiar streets, but then the scenery began to change. The bustling roads gave way to quieter lanes, and the shops and houses grew sparse. My unease deepened. I leaned forward, shouting over the roar of the engine, "Hey, you missed the turn!" He didn't answer. He didn't even flinch. His posture was rigid, his hands locked on the handlebars, guiding the bike with mechanical precision. An icy knot formed in my stomach. I tapped his shoulder harder. I said, "You missed the turn. Where are you taking me?" Silence. The world around us was changing. The buildings disappeared, replaced by tall, looming trees that curled overhead, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. Shadows danced across the path, dark and sinister, bending in ways that defied logic. Panic surged through me. I looked around, trying to find a landmark, something familiar, but there was nothing. just an endless road surrounded by an ancient, tangled forest. "Stop! I want to get off!" I screamed, my voice shaking with fear. I pounded on his back, my fists hitting solid muscle beneath his coat, but he didn't react. The bike sped up, the engine growling as we plunged deeper into the woods. The air grew colder, heavier, weighing down on me like a shroud. I could barely breathe, each gasp feeling like ice in my lungs. A foul stench filled my nose, the sickly, sweet smell of decay and damp earth. It was suffocating. I looked down and realized the road beneath us wasn't made of asphalt anymore. It was dirt, dark and wet, covered in gnarled roots that writhed like snakes as we passed over them. They seemed alive, shifting and curling, reaching out as if to grab me. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The trees closed in, their branches bending impossibly low, their bark cracked and oozing with something black and viscous. Faces seemed to form within the twisted knots, hollow eyes watching me, mouths open in silent screams. The man's grip tightened on the handlebars, his fingers long and thin, too long, curling around the metal like talons. His head tilted, and I saw his reflection in the visor. Empty, hollow sockets where eyes should have been, a skeletal grin stretching far too wide. Terror consumed me. I fought to let go, to jump off, but my hands wouldn't move. It felt as if invisible chains were wrapped around me, holding me in place. My body was no longer my own. We burst into a clearing, the bike skidding to a stop. I was thrown off, landing hard on the ground, the breath knocked out of me. I looked up and felt my blood turn to ice. A house stood before me, ancient and decaying, its wooden boards warped and rotting. It leaned to one side, as if struggling to stay upright. The windows were shattered, dark holes gaping like empty eye sockets. The door was open, swaying slowly, creaking with each movement. The man got off the bike, his limbs cracking and twisting unnaturally. His neck snapped to the side, his head lolling at an impossible angle. He took a step toward me, his body jerking, bending in ways no human could move. His voice came, hollow and echoing, layered with a chorus of whispers. "You wanted a ride? Now you'll never leave." His helmet fell off, clattering to the ground, and his face was a nightmare. Skin stretched tight over sharp bones, hollow eyes that burned with a pale, sickly light, and a mouth full of jagged, broken teeth. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my legs heavy and numb. The forest twisted around me, the trees shifting, closing off every path. The roots moved, curling around my ankles, trying to pull me down. I fought them, ripping free, my skin burning where they touched. His laughter echoed all around, a chilling sound that made my blood freeze. Run all you want, the road never ends. I stumbled into darkness, the world spinning, the air thick and cold. I looked back and he was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, his hollow eyes glowing, his grin impossibly wide. The shadows reached out for me, cold fingers brushing against my skin, pulling me back. I screamed, my voice lost in the void. And then everything went black. They say they found me lying by the roadside, my body cold, my eyes open and unseeing. I don't remember how I got back, but I remember the forest, the house, and his face. I remember his laughter, his voice echoing in my head even now. I never take bodas anymore. I never travel alone. And every Valentine's Day I stay home, locking the doors, closing the windows, praying I never hear that engine's hum again, because somewhere out there, he's still riding, waiting for his next passenger, for another soul to trap on that endless, cursed road.